Hey, this is the 80s Slasher Librarian, just letting you guys know if you enjoy the content here on the channel and want to support the channel, click on the Patreon link in the description below. As I'm not allowed to monetize the channel here on YouTube, I depend on you guys to keep this channel going and growing by becoming patrons of the channel and sponsoring at the Patreon page. There's great rewards for doing so in tiers as low as $2 to $5 per month. Enjoy tonight's upload of Halloween, guys. Thanks. Halloween, Chapter 10. The trick-or-treaters were in full bloom. The children had poured out of their homes simultaneously, as if on some signal unheard by grown-ups. Lori stood on the sidewalk outside her house, one eye cocked for Annie's red two-door hardtop, and watched the procession of pirates, clowns, cowboys, witches, skeletons, ballerinas, policemen, firemen, doctors, nurses, and soldiers that trooped up and down the block in clusters of 4 or 5, methodically working the streets with their ever-fattening, mass-produced orange and black shopping bags. What touched her most deeply was the realization that these children were free and safe to roam the streets unhindered, unworried by the bullies and muggers and purse snatchers that lay in wait in the shadows of New York or Chicago or other big cities. Oh, 1 or 2 knots of children were accompanied by an adult, but this was for traffic supervision, not protection against crime. The littlest ones tended to cross streets without looking at this dusky hour, where the all but settled sun glinted with a brightness equal to the orange jack-o'-lanterns that rested on porch railings or in windows in every house. Oh, one did read in the newspapers every year about some mad person who hated children and injected poison into apples or concealed razor blades in trick-or-treat candy. But that wasn't why the occasional parent could be seen tagging along with a pack of beggar children, looking foolish in grown-up clothes or even more foolish in costume. No, there was no danger to the child who walked the sundown streets of Haddonfield. At least not, Lori pondered, from without. But from within? Was it not possible that among these dozens of gaily cavorting children there was one capable of a crime so heinous it made the gorge rise in your throat just to think about it? It would be ridiculous, laughable, had it not been so 15 years ago, this very night. They said he had on a clown costume, Lori said, scanning the little revelers for a clown costume. She found 4 in the space of a minute. That one of them could produce a knife and ventilate her entrails was a thought far more horrifying than the thought of the same knife wielded by some city cutthroat, from whom you at least expected it. Lori flashed for a second on Judith Myers and tried to put herself in Judy's place as the boy with the rosy cheeks and fawn eyes exposed the blade of his butcher knife and began to advance on her. "It's a joke. You can stop now," Lori heard herself telling her own imaginary kid brother. But the kid brother did not stop, and when he brought the blade up and then down that first time, just before that point penetrated your flesh, you knew something about evil that had been forgotten for centuries, maybe millennia. You knew in that instant that everything you had been brought up to believe, everything you had counted on for security, everything you looked for granted as normal, all of it was a lie of such enormity that if you could live for another 100 years, let alone another 5 seconds, you could never fully grasp it. In that instant of frozen time between the downward thrust of the child's arm and the searing agony of his blade plunging hotly into your body, Your mind took stock of everything that had meant comfort to you. The television set and the air conditioner, the late model car with 300 horsepower and rack and pinion steering and disc brakes, the refrigerator freezer that made ice cubes, the electric range that signaled you when your toast was ready, your gas heater that flicked on automatically when the temperature in your home dropped below 65 degrees, the happy house and loving parents and terrific teachers and great friends. You surveyed them all, and they were lies, lies. For when it came to shielding your belly from this crazed 6-year-old's right hand, these comforts were as thin as the silk panties that shielded it now, for all the protection they rendered. "Trick or treat!" Laurie clutched her stomach involuntarily. "Get away from me!" she screamed. The children's eyes rounded, and they backed away several steps. Laurie caught her breath and laughed sheepishly. "Oh, I'm sorry, you snuck up on me. This is my house here. Go up to the door. My mother has some goodies for you." "Get a grip on yourself," Laurie said to herself as the children trapezed up to her front door. Annie's car whipped around the corner and screeched to a stop. Laurie walked around to the passenger side and got in. She sniffed the air. "Do you have to smoke that stuff when you drive?" "Well, excuse me!" "Look, I'm no prude, but there are kids all over the place tonight, so drive carefully, huh?" "Yes, Mommy," Annie said, pulling away from the curb with exaggerated caution. "Where are we going?" "The usual. Just a cruise around town to see who's hanging out and with whom. Then on to our babysitting assignments, barf. And you ask if I have to smoke," she said, groping around her purse and removing a clumsily rolled joint in canary yellow paper. At a stop sign she lit it, pulling on it with the hissing intake of air and offering it to Laurie. Grass never did much for Laurie, and she didn't expect it to do much this time, but it was the social thing to do, so she dragged on it the way she'd been taught. She must have hit a hot spot in the joint, or perhaps it was a particularly rough weed because she started to cough uncontrollably. Annie took the joint back. "You'll never make a good dope addict," she said, hitting it again. They drove casually in the general direction of town, Laurie holding in her lap the pumpkin she'd brought for Tommy Doyle. They passed a few friends, nobody special, so they honked and waved and drove on. "You still spooked?" Annie asked her friend. "I wasn't spooked." "Lies!" "I saw someone standing in Mr. Riddle's backyard, that's all." "Probably Mr. Riddle." "He was watching me, though." "Mr. Riddle was watching you?" Annie gave that 3-note giggle she always seemed to utter when she was getting high. "Laurie, Mr. Riddle is like 87. "He can still watch." "That's probably all he can do." Annie looked in her rearview mirror before hanging a left and casually noted the same station wagon she'd shouted at after school. It was about 50 yards behind her. It was probably nothing, and not wanting to alarm Laurie more than the poor girl was already alarmed, Annie decided to say nothing. But she wondered who this El Creepo was. If you're trying to meet a couple of chicks, this sure wasn't the way to go about it. And if you're some kind of pervert, tailing chicks through the streets of a small town is about as subtle as throwing a bomb into a police station. She checked the rearview mirror again, and he was gone. Too bad. Now she'd never know. But she had a thought by association, and she uttered it. "Have you ever worn a mask?" "Huh?" "When you wear a mask, like at Halloween, but I mean a really good one that disguises your face so that people really don't know who you are." "What about it?" Laurie's brow wrinkled as she waited for the punchline. "I was just thinking, you can say or do anything from behind that mask because people don't know who you are." "It's like the Alexandria Quartet," said Laurie. "Lawrence Durrell?" "I never read that." "I'm sure," Laurie teased. "Somewhere in one of those novels, Durrell describes the terrible things that happen on carnival night because people wear masks. Murders, rapes, people hiding behind the anonymity to take advantage of each other." "Oh, goody. Can I get a student discount on a ticket to Alexandria?" "Be serious, Annie. You're the one who started this conversation." "Sorry, but see, that's just what I mean. The idea of not being responsible for anything I do because I'm wearing a mask. It's kind of arousing." For you, maybe. But then you find everything arousing, don't you? Oh, well, that's the kind of girl I am. Maybe you ought to put on a mask and let some of your inhibitions out. Do something mad. It's Halloween. What better time to raise a little hell? I'll bet that deep down inside of you there's a fiend who'd push little old ladies in front of cars if you thought you could get away with it. Never, Laurie said, then pausing a beat as a sly smile spread over her face. Little old men, maybe, but never little old ladies. They burst into gills of laughter. What's the pumpkin for? Annie said, tapping the object in her friend's lap. I brought it for Tommy. I figured that making a jack-o'-lantern would keep him occupied. I always said you'd make a fabulous Girl Scout. Gee, thanks. For that matter, I might as well be a Girl Scout tonight myself, she sighed. Because you got shot down, you mean? Laurie said. Yeah, I guess. I guess we'll make popcorn and watch Dr. Dementia. 6 straight hours of horror movies. Little Lindsay Wallace won't know what hit her. Better horror movies than the real thing, said Laurie. Annie's brows furrowed. Now, what is that supposed to mean? Nothing, just some morbid thoughts I've been having today. Annie offered her friend the half-smoked joint. Girl, you'd better take a great big hit of this thing, honey. It's a sure cure for the morbids. Laurie pushed it away. Annie, do you ever think about, well, evil? Uh-oh, it's serious time with Laurie. Laurie held her peace, forcing Annie to reflect. Well, you know, Daddy's a cop, and he's told me some things. I don't know if you could call them evil, exactly. We don't get much of it around here. We don't get much of anything around here. But when he worked in Columbus, he saw some pretty heavy things go down. Beatings, rapes, murders. Sounded evil enough to me. Anyway, I try not to think about stuff like that. Whenever I do, I switch the channel. I wish I could turn my mind off as easily as you, Laurie lamented. It's easy when you don't have that much of a mind to begin with. Hey, speaking about my father... As the car bore around a gentle curving approach to town, they saw the sheriff's car parked outside Nicholson's hardware store. The car's revolving red and blue lights and flashers illuminated the hardware, candy, and liquor stores adjoining it as darkness began to descend on Haddonfield. An alarm bell rang shrilly, and a knot of onlookers stared at Annie's father as he stood in front of the broken plate glass window, examining the damage. Annie and Laurie hastily rolled their windows down and waved their hands, like frightened birds, to chase the cloying smoke smell out of the car. Annie noticed the station wagon that had been following them peel off down Main Street as she pulled her car over to the curb. Hi, Annie, Laurie. Huh? What? He pointed at the hardware store, and Annie realized the man hadn't heard her over the clangor of the alarm bell. She repeated her question louder. Then he replied, Someone broke into the hardware store, probably kids. You blame everything on kids, Annie rejoined. He shrugged. The only thing missing were some Halloween masks, rope, and a set of carving knives, as far as Mr. Nichols has been able to figure, that is. What does that sound like to you, a middle management executive for IBM? Annie looked at her friend. It's hard growing up with the cynic, Laurie. Don't you have a babysitting job, sweetheart? Her father shouted over the alarm. What? I said, don't you have a babysitting job? You're going to be late. He shouts, too, Annie said, waving at her father. The girls rolled up their windows and laughed. Do you think he smelled anything? Laurie asked, testing the air with her nostrils. My father, he's a good cop, but he's a lousy detective. I hope so. I'd hate for it to get back to my folks. Listen, Laurie, if your parents don't know you smoke grass, they probably haven't noticed you've grown boobs either. She glanced sidelong at Laurie's chest. I take that back. I'm not sure anybody's noticed you've grown boobs. Damn daughter's been smoking whoopee weed again, Sheriff Brackett muttered to himself as he observed a dour-looking bald man with a gray goatee stepping out of the crowd. The man wore a chocolate-colored suit beneath a rumpled trench coat. Sheriff, I'm Dr. Sam Loomis, the man shouted over the alarm. Lee Brackett, the sheriff said, looking at him critically. We don't need a doctor, it's just a routine break-in. I'm not that kind of doctor. I'd like to talk with you if I could." "It may be a few minutes. I gotta stick around here, buddy." "It's important." His eyes, sunken and slightly red-rimmed, appealed to Brackett like a hound's at the dinner table. Brackett looked at his watch and shrugged. 10 minutes? "I'll be here," Loomis said, turning just a moment too late to notice the station wagon he'd been hunting pull away after its occupant had stopped to observe him. Brackett didn't see it either. He had heard the call come over the radio last night and this morning, and though nobody had fully explained who was supposed to be driving the liver-colored station wagon with the state emblem on the doors, he'd have chased it down routinely. Loomis killed the 10 minutes with a stroll down Main Street, looking indifferently into windows of stores and shops that were interchangeable with those of any town this size in the Midwest. There were a few signs of changing times, such as organic health food shops, a bookstore with a surprisingly intellectual selection of titles in the window, and a coffee shop specializing in espresso, cappuccino, and herbal teas, a far cry from the usual Midwest coffee shop purveying the kind of diner fare that truck drivers thrived on. But at least there was no head shop, as one commonly saw in bigger Midwestern towns and cities. No shops selling cigarette papers, pipes, Coke spoons, and the more exotic paraphernalia of the dope trade. Though Loomis knew that the kids used drugs in these towns, the town governments came down very hard on any overt display of drug cultures. As Loomis passed the liquor store, he nodded, remembering his teenage son's recent tirade about the hypocrisy of Loomis's generation, that punishes drug use but proudly displays its alcoholic orientation as if drinking were a virtue to be encouraged. The boy was right, but it would be another decade before you saw a head shop in Haddonfield, Illinois. Brackett was just finishing writing up his report and supervising the hasty assembly of a sawhorse barrier around the hardware store. Mr. Nichols put the finishing touches on a wooden panel to cover the broken window until a glass replacement arrived in the morning. He stepped back to survey his handiwork and examined the rim of the window, as if to contemplate the possibility of putting up a locked iron gate. He shook his head sadly. He hated to do that. To put up a gate would not only be ugly, it would symbolize his concession to the growing vandalism that existed in this town. "May we sit in your car, Sheriff?" Loomis asked. "Suit yourself, Doctor." They slid into the front seat. Brackett turned the heater on. "Getting a bit chilly. Winter'll be here any day now." Lewis said distractedly, running his fingers down the blue barrels of the sheriff's over-and-under 12-gauge shotgun propped vertically between the seats. "Have you ever had to use this thing?" "Can't catch quail with my bare hands," Brackett laughed. "You know what I mean." Brackett shook his head. "I've pointed it at one or two alleged perpetrators, as my colleagues like to call them." "Who do you think perpetrated that?" Loomis asked with a jerk of the head toward the hardware store. "Kids, most likely. Who else would steal Halloween masks, man? And knives and rope. What do kids need with those?" "Beats the hell out of me. Sometimes they break in and grab whatever's near to hand, just because it's there for grabbing." He gazed at Loomis, whose face glowed green in the phosphorescent light of the dashboard. "You got any better ideas?" "I might. Do you remember the Judith Myers case?" Brackett's gaze narrowed to a suspicious stare. "Of course I do." There was a silence as Loomis ran his fingers with a scratchy noise through his goatee. Brackett waited impatiently, studying this man whose intrusion into his life had brought with it intimations of grisly horror, a horror made more dreadful because it had happened in this idyllic setting. Over the police channel, staticky squawks proclaimed petty vandalism occurring throughout the area. "Intruders reported on Carter Road around the Gleason farm. Windows broken by 4 persons in masks, believed to be children. Carty House and Post Road near Deller. 3 trespassers report riding on doors with spray paint." "What were you saying, Doctor?" Loomis told him the escape from the Sanitarium last night. Brackett listened with a troubled expression. "The Myers house. Will you take me there?" Brackett tapped the steering wheel with his nails. "I don't know, Loomis. I got my hands full tonight. You just heard it on the radio. Halloween is one of my profession's busy seasons. Can you hear what's coming down?" He turned the radio louder. Loomis listened solidly, expressionlessly. "This is all the work of children," he protested at length. "Harmless pranks. Do you call broken windows and spray-painted doors harmless? Try repairing them sometime. Try paying for them. Across the country, the damages amount to millions. Millions, Doctor. But we're talking about something else, Sheriff. Another dimension. I don't know about other dimensions, Loomis, but I know that the harm being rendered by your so-called sweet innocent kiddies tonight is more real to me than something perpetrated by a nutcase 15 years back. An escaped nutcase." Loomis's distinction made a telling point on the sheriff. "Well, that's true," he conceded reluctantly. Loomis drove the point home. "Do you think this man has come home to soak people's windows?" He rubbed his goatee heavily, until it sounded like a carpenter sandpapering a table. Brackett shrugged. "I suppose it's worth a look, but I guarantee you're not going to find anything." "That, Sheriff, is a guarantee I would too gladly accept." Another squawk came over the radio. "Fire reported in meadow behind Cockner Farm, Route 167A off Market Road," the voice droned. "Kids will be kids," the sheriff laughed bitterly. Loomis still wasn't sure Brackett had gotten the full point. As Brackett nosed his car into the dark, cloudy night, he reviewed for Loomis everything he knew or had heard about the Myers case. Loomis listened attentively, though from his half-closed lids Brackett might have concluded the man was dozing off. Brackett said nothing Loomis didn't already know, until something slipped out casually that made the psychiatrist's eyes widen and his back stiffen. "Would you mind repeating that, Sheriff?" "I said the kid's great-grandfather had done something similar." "Tell me about it." Loomis was breathing harder. Brackett's casual remark had excited him, as if he were a starving man that someone had dangled a piece of cake in front of. "Well, I don't rightly know much about it, and it was never brought out in the hearings, but Mrs. Myers that night was overheard saying, 'He's come back,' or maybe 'It's come back,' over and over again. I didn't live here then, so this is all second-hand hearsay. Go on." "So Ron Barstow, he was the sheriff at the time. Ron asked her, 'Who's come back? What's come back?' And she mumbled something or other about the thing that had got inside her grandfather. I guess she meant possession. Took possession of him." Despite the coldness of the evening, Loomis had begun to perspire. His breath hissed noisily. "Did she explain about that thing that had taken possession of her grandfather?" "No, but Ron went to the records at Town Hall and checked out the newspaper clippings at the Historical Society. And it seems the man had gone berserk back in the 1890s. Loomis was on the edge of his seat, his eyes bulging. "Berserk? How?" "It was at Grand Dance. Like I think Ron said. The man just upped and pulled a revolver from his belt and blasted a dancing couple. They hanged him for it." They drove silently for a moment, Loomis struggling to contain his excitement, almost savoring the next question. "When did this happen?" 1898, 99, somewhere around there." No, I mean what date?" "How should I? Wait a minute. Of course I know. Ron remarked on it." "Yes?" "All Hallow Even, it was the name of the dance. It was a harvest dance. Halloween." Brackett's toe unconsciously depressed the gas pedal, and the car accelerated into the dangerous night. "Jesus!" the sheriff breathed. "Why wasn't this mentioned at the hearing?" Loomis demanded, slumping back into his seat, still panting. "I think Ron said it was because the defense attorney thought it was either irrelevant or damaging to the kid's case." "Irrelevant? Damaging?" Loomis chuckled dryly, a laugh totally devoid of humor, like a rattle. "Tell me, Did your friend tell you anything more about this great-grandfather? I'm thinking. The seconds ticked ponderously around the clock on the dashboard. Voices. Voices. Kill those two specifically. In other words, he didn't fire into a crowd at random. He knew the victims. Brackett scratched his ear. I'm a little confused about that part. The way Ron explained it, the guy claimed he knew who he was shooting. But when they asked him to identify his victims, he called them some weird names he said he'd heard in his dreams. Brackett pointed to his own skull and made a rotary motion with his finger. Loco. Perhaps. These names, Sheriff, were they Celtic? Would you recognize them? Deirdre, Culain. Sorry, my friend, they don't ring a bell. Who are they? Names of victims in Michael's dreams. If we could establish a continuity from the great-grandfather to the boy, the psychiatrist mused. A continuity? Brackett couldn't believe it. Come on, Loomis. In order for a dream to jump 2 or 3 generations, you'd have to believe. He shook his head. Doctor, I think you may be touched yourself. Probably. It's an occupational hazard. Brackett swung right and glided to the curb before the gloomy, weather-beaten house that stood out among its white, neatly kempt neighbors like some shriveled crone in a row of teenagers. They climbed out of the car and stood before it, listening to the sound of branches whipping against an upstairs window. Has anybody lived here since? You gotta be kidding, Brackett said. Every kid in Haddonfield thinks this place is haunted. Between you and me, maybe every adult, too. They may very well be right. Brackett reached into his car and produced a long flashlight, pointing it at the for sale sign thrust into the scrubby lawn. The sheriff then said, his parents found him standing right there in his clown costume, with the ruff around the neck, cute as could be, except he held a butcher knife as long as this flashlight, and he was smeared with fresh blood. He flashed his light on the sign. This should come down. I hear it's been sold. Chester Strode must be drunk with relief. He's the agent. Sold, Loomis repeated, shaking his head with disbelief. I know what you mean. New York people. They thought it'd be fun to own a haunted house. New Yorkers. He groaned, using the word almost as a curse. Can we go in? I don't have a key, but maybe. They mounted the front porch. We could go in through one of the broken windows, Loomis suggested. That's what I was going to suggest. Loomis stepped to the front door, on which the sheriff held his light. The knob dangled at an odd angle, and there were fresh gouges in the wood around it. Brackett touched the knob, and the door swung open. One haunted house, complete with creaks, he said. If you find it so amusing, why are you taking your gun out of its holster? Loomis asked with a grim smile. Brackett didn't care for the remark. Flashing the light around the entry, he stepped in cautiously, crouched tensely as he scanned the rooms with his light-guided eyes, then gestured with his head for Loomis to follow. Carefully they trod the floorboards, Loomis moving back to back with his friend, like a pair of eyes in the back of the sheriff's head. The psychiatrist kept his right hand plunged deep in the pocket of his trench coat. Suddenly Brackett stopped. Loomis backed into him. What is it? The light revealed something resembling a white and black shaggy throw rug with jagged red streaks. Brackett kneeled over it and gulped. It's a dog. He reached out and dipped a finger into the entrails that had been ripped out of the creature and draped across its hind legs casually. Still warm. Lord! Loomis looked at the mutilated creature, its bulging eyes orangely reflecting the light. He got hungry. He? You mean... Come on, Doctor. It could have been a skunk or a raccoon. Could have been, Loomis said unenthusiastically. A man wouldn't do that, Brackett said, holding the light on the glistening guts. He isn't a man, Loomis replied. They turned their backs on the remains and searched the rest of the downstairs. The place was in shambles. Floorboards ripped up, plaster and lathing chipped or ripped off the walls, damp spots in the ceiling. Brackett made several more sarcastic remarks about the people from New York. "Shall we go upstairs?" Loomis said. Of course. What tour of a haunted house would be complete without a look at the upstairs?" "After you, Sheriff." Brackett snorted and stepped ahead of Loomis. They inched up the stairs, staying close to the wall, for the balustrade was a wreck. As they approached the landing, Brackett paused and caught his breath. "What do you suppose that noise is?" Loomis cocked his ear. "I believe it's a branch slapping a window. It's coming from that room there. I saw it when we were on the lawn." "Of course," Brackett said, crunching over some plaster pebbles. Holding gun and flashlight close together, he stepped into the near bedroom. The noise was indeed what Loomis had said. "This is where it happened. She was sitting there, brushing her hair. I'm told she just had panties on. He came in here, and of course she recognized him and did nothing to defend herself. Why should she? He was her 6-year-old kid brother, for crying out loud. They found her here, under this." A sudden gust of wind slapped the branch against the window with terrible force, smashing it and showering glass at their feet. Both men leaped back, uttering curses. Then they laughed nervously. Brackett led Loomis through the rest of the upstairs at double time, then said, "Nothing here, let's go." Outside, Brackett leaned against his car. "What do we do now?" "He was here, and he may be coming back. I'm going to wait for him. I keep thinking I should call in help. Maybe get a warning broadcast. If you do, people will see him everywhere, on every street corner, in every home. Just tell your men to shut their mouths and open their eyes." The sheriff gestured at his shotgun. "You want something?" "I've got something." Loomis pulled a .357 Magnum out of his raincoat. Brackett whistled. "It looks like a naval gun." "Don't worry. It's licensed." "Lord, you're loaded for bear," the sheriff said. Meanwhile, he kept his headlights off as he followed the red car with the 2 girls in it, and he kept his distance. His heart beat heavily but rhythmically. But the beat had accelerated since sundown, and it was beginning to make him nervous and agitated. His palms were sweaty and his mouth dry, and he was uncomfortably aroused, a condition of pain and not pleasure. He drove past the orange glowing pumpkin faces that seemed to mock him, past the eager laughing children parading from house to house in their foolish costumes. He remembered the clown suit he had worn that night, red and green with a lace ruff and a sock cap, with a silly ball at the end of it that kept dangling in front of his nose. He remembered his grandmother's smell as she took a tuck in the material of his costume. He remembered the taste of candy corn at the party that evening, remembered biting off the white tips of the pyramid-shaped candies, then the orange middle, then the yellow bottom, trying to determine if they were made of different tasting stuff, but they were the same candy dyed 3 different colors. He remembered, too, how in the middle of it, in the middle of ducking for apples, the feeling had come over him, a force like an iron hand that virtually shoved him out of the door and into the street, his little legs carrying him home, and a voice telling him what he had to do. In his mind's eye he had seen, that night, a picture of his sister as he had seen it a few times through the keyhole of her bedroom, or in the crack of the bathroom door, pink, firm, with beautiful tight buttocks and round high breasts with jutting nipples. And the voice told him he must carve those breasts and buttocks into 1,000 slabs of bloody meat. He remembered his own internal voice protesting, but it was such a helpless little boy voice, till the grown-up voice had shouted it down easily, and urged his little legs home faster, instructing him to go into the house through the kitchen door, remove the butcher knife from the drawer under the sink, and go upstairs. He remembered the look in her eyes as he entered her room, a look that darkened from surprise to recognition to horror in the space of a second. He remembered the little boy voice crying, "What are you doing?" But the grown-up voice crying, "Stick her in belly, stick her in heart, stick it in her face, stick it in her arms, stick it in her legs, stab her, cut her, slice her, slash her, kill 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 her!" He had known she was screaming because he saw her lips moving, but he heard nothing but the roar of the grown-up voice in his ears. He remembered the heat of her blood as it splashed his hands, and the strangely familiar smell of it. He remembered looking at her almost unrecognizable remains on the floor, and hearing the little voice saying, "Uh-oh, you're going to get in a lot of trouble when Mommy and Daddy get home." And that's just what happened. Mommy and Daddy were very mad at him when they came home. And now the voice was talking to him again. And it was almost the same way, except that he was a grown-up himself now, and he was big and strong as his daddy. And this time nobody would be able to take him away and send him someplace. The brake lights of the car in front of him went on, and he hit his own brakes, drifting to the side of the road to watch. The blonde girl got out, the one who had come up to the door of his home this morning. The one who reminded him so much of Judy. He watched her go up to the White House and ring the doorbell while her friend turned into the driveway of the large house across the street and pull into a garage. The door opened for the blonde girl and she stepped inside. Then, across the street, the dark-haired girl emerged from the garage, rang the doorbell, and was also admitted. He watched. 5 minutes later, a man and woman came out of each house. The man and woman coming out of the house where the blonde had gone kissed a little boy goodbye. The man and the woman coming out of the house the dark-haired girl had gone kissed a little girl goodbye. Then each couple got into a car. They went off in different directions. He got out of the station wagon and slid into the hedgerows around the house with the blonde and the little boy in it. The dark uniform he'd taken off the driver blending with the night shadows. He sidled up to a window. Beyond it was a darkened room, but through an open door at the other end he could see the girl, who reminded him so much of Judy, talking to the boy. The boy was almost as young as he'd been 15 years ago. The boy was wearing a shiny jumpsuit with astronaut patches on it. This was the boy he'd seen bullied at school today. He walked around the house, silently testing windows and doors, noting that a pair of French windows outside the television room were open, but not venturing inside yet. Not yet. He drifted back to the front of the house and pressed against the hedges as a gaggle of children passed by. Close enough for him to grab. It was too dangerous. When it was safe, he ventured across the street. The house was enormous, with a large porch on 2 sides. Again he walked around it, looking in the windows. He saw the dark-haired girl standing before a hall mirror, brushing out her hair and chatting to the little girl who watched her admiringly. The dark-haired girl had big breasts that jutted out even with her arms stretched overhead. He stalked like a cat to the side and back of the house, noting an unlocked kitchen door. In the backyard, a slate path led to a little house-like bungalow. He went up to it and peered inside. It had a washer and a dryer. He returned to the main house and watched some more. The sex between his legs throbbed in an unpleasant way. The voice was whispering something to him that he couldn't make out yet, but he knew that if he waited, it would get louder. In his belt were the carving knife and rope he had taken from the store in town. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been the very long and very interesting Chapter 10 of Halloween, the novelization by Curtis Richards. I gotta say, kind of left on a really interesting part there tonight, but I promise I'll be picking back up on the next upload very soon. I can't wait to keep reading it myself. There's enough differences in this book to keep it fresh, you know. We've all seen the movie a bunch, at least I know I have. But even after seeing this movie so many times in my life, I'm still really entertained by this book. However, Michael's inner monologue was a bit creepy tonight, I guess. The whole getting aroused thing was not what I expected to read, but not judging the book. Gonna wait it out. I know it's different than the movie, so let's see how it all pans out. That was just kind of weird, kind of a curveball thrown at me that I wasn't really expecting. And, Loomis is a bit different in the book than he is in the movie. So I'm curious to see how their scenes together are going to play out later in the book. Like their confrontation happens towards the end of the movie. So, yeah, guys, tonight was very interesting. We got a lot of inner monologue of Michael. We got some inner monologue of his from the time he killed Judith, whenever he was a little kid, and now we got his inner monologue now, where he's getting a painful erection for something. But yeah, these are my thoughts. I could go on and on, but I cannot wait to hear from you guys tonight. Let me know what you thought of this chapter. I gotta say, the killer thing was a little Pamela Voorhees type thing, you know what I mean? Like what was going on in her head. But it was still cool. I'm not dissing it completely. Gonna keep on going before I make any more judgments. And as always, tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page: Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Cecilia Spears, and Sean Campbell. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. And going forward, listeners, I'm going to have to start depending on the Patreon to keep this channel going. If I could just monetize the channel with ads, I would, but the copyright owners are getting all the ad revenue. That's why I've got the Patreon page, but I am trying to put some pretty cool stuff on there to make it worth your while, and it's only $2 to $5 per month at the lowest tier. So if you want to sponsor the channel, click that link in the description below and become a patron of the 80s Slasher Librarian YouTube channel today, and get some cool early access to certain content and some pretty cool rewards for doing so, and you're going to help this channel keep going and growing for years to come. Alright guys, I'll be back very soon with more of Halloween. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening, thanks for stopping by the library, and have a great night.